and we have three faculty members from Jindal University, Sachin Dawan, Dr. Sachin Dawan, Ms. Shama Banu Abbasi, who's my assistant at the Center, Gandhi Center, Mahatma Gandhi Center for Peace, and Professor Gerd Ferdinand Kirchhoff, who is also a professor at the law school, like myself. Now, of course, we did not cover the aspects. We covered the religion, literature, part of philosophy, I would say, and history, but we did not cover law, which was one of the important aspects also that we need to cover. And with our free speakers, fortunately, we're going to cover aspects of justice, law, revenge. Actually, the title actually that Dr. Kirchhoff, Professor Kirchhoff is talking about is actually revengeful victims, and not question mark, not revenge for victims. And that's the right title. And of course, the death penalty. So mostly about victimology and victims, and either retributive justice, is it correct or not, or do we have to have the punishment, retributive punishment or not? So without further ado, I give the floor to Dr. Sachin Dawan, who will talk about the death penalty, a cruel and unusual punishment.
Thank you so much, Ramin. Let me just begin by saying that sadly I'm not a doctor, but I hope to be one someday. And also let me say that it's been a wonderful conference so far, Ramin. Thank you so much. This has been so illuminating. I almost forgot in the middle that I was a part of the center organizing it. It was so good. And let me also begin by asking for the forgiveness of the students who are gathered here, upon whom we have maybe exacted the revenge of making them sit through what has been a long day. I was just told by the warden who has accompanied you during the break that many of you did not have the staying power to make it through. But for those of you who did, I think you will agree with me that you have made the right decision. As far as the topic of the day, revenge and forgiveness, is concerned, many different views have been expressed, as Ramin was saying, from many different perspectives. And what I want to say, begin with, is actually with something that was said in the last session, when it comes to the understanding of revenge and forgiveness. And a lot of people talked about different conceptions of both revenge and forgiveness. And I think one difference that we are living through in our current present political climate when it comes to these ideas of revenge and forgiveness, beginning in the mid-1970s, is that we are moving from forgiveness to revenge. I think if we look at the history of the world, someone mentioned in the last session that there's always been killing and there's always been depredations and all of these terrible things. But I think that in the 20th century, there was a break. In the mid-20th century, there was a break, not necessarily in terms of the atrocities that were committed, but in terms of the value that was placed on forgiveness. So if you look at, for example, again, references that were made in the last session, people like Genghis Khan and others, when they committed their atrocities, one can think of it perhaps in terms of revenge, of village, of tribe, nation, etc. They were celebrated for it. There was no sense that what they were doing is wrong. It was something that contributed to the glory of the leader, you know. But when we think of this, and that's how it has been, how it was for a very long time. But when we think of this midpoint of the 20th century, where we had this break, it was no longer sufficient to be seen as someone who was powerful. I mean, Hitler and Mussolini were extremely powerful individuals, but because of the acts that they committed, they were condemned for it. And this represents a break from the past. And it actually goes back to Woodrow Wilson and the First World War and his plan for a League of Nations after the First World War, where you had this notion that no matter what actually happens on the ground, it is something to be, the idea of forgiveness or coming together or amity, comity, unity is something that nations and leaders should strive for. And their greatness, unlike the greatness of Genghis Khan, comes not from how much they conquer, but how much they are able to come together and, in a sense, forgive, right? At least in theory, on paper. But I think since the mid-1970s, we're going back in the other direction. You know, we made this break in the mid-20th century from what happened before, where we moved from revenge to forgiveness. And you can say roughly from the mid-40s to the mid-70s, you had this move from revenge to forgiveness. You see also in this time, in the 40s, the flowering, the ultimate success of the Indian independence struggle under Gandhi's leadership, which is, as many have already talked about, based very centrally on the concept of forgiveness. You see in the United States during this period where we're going from forgiveness, from revenge to forgiveness, mid-40s to mid-70s, you see the flowering of the civil rights movement in the United States and the peace movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, which were again based centrally on concepts of integration, coming together, forgiving your enemy, your oppressor, trying to understand the vantage point of the other party whom you oppose or who's on the other side. People have talked about South Africa and the struggle against apartheid. This is also something that begins during this time period. So mid-40s to mid-70s, it's from revenge to forgiveness. But mid-70s until today, I think we've been going from forgiveness to revenge. Because in various different contexts, in various different countries, which I'm sure many here know much more about than I do, but what we are seeing is a general trend towards a kind of displacement of forgiveness and a focus on revenge. Now, earlier, Mrs. Vajpayee talked about revenge in the context of Indian mythology and the Mahabharata. And it was very interesting, I thought, that she described revenge as tit for tat, or getting even. And if you look at the politics of the world, or at least the industrialized world, broadly speaking, from the mid-70s until today, it has become a politics of tit for tat or getting even. And the culmination of that is the Trump phenomenon that we saw last year, right? Because that campaign is probably as far away from forgiveness as you can possibly get, right? And it talked about how the American people could get even. Because what was happening and what had been happening in the US for the 30, 40 years preceding the election is this feeling amongst the majority of the population that they were not being heard, they were not being listened to, right? And they wanted to take revenge for that. And Trump became the vehicle for their desire to take revenge. In the last session, there was a discussion of revenge and forgiveness in the context of Hindu-Muslim relations. And again, I think one can broadly categorize the post-independence period into two parts. Again, one is from independence, which is the mid to late 1940s until roughly about the 80s, and another is from the 80s until today, closely mirroring the global cutting off point that I described. And again, there you see a movement from revenge to forgiveness, broadly speaking, from the 40s to the 80s, and then from forgiveness to revenge from the 80s to today. 40s to the 80s, again, there's this, in terms of the larger political discourse and discussion, there's this context or notion of coming together as a country with many diverse parts, building on the legacy left by Gandhi and then by Nehru. But with the rise of the Babri movement that was perhaps alluded to and briefly discussed in the 1980s, you see that breaking apart. And again, what is similar in the Indian context of why we're moving from forgiveness to revenge to the global context of why we're moving from forgiveness to revenge is the feeling amongst the majority of the population that they have been done in by elites for some reason, real or imagined, and they want to take revenge, right? So I feel like the language of politics that is being used in today's world is very much a language of revenge, of getting even. And we've moved away or discarded the legacy that we had, that brief break that we had from the 40s to the 70s, the 40s to the 80s, where we actually moved from revenge to forgiveness. Now, the problem with this is something, if I could focus on again on the Indian case for a moment, but I think this applies to the US as well, which is another country you know a little bit about. I'm sure it applies to much of Europe also, but I'm not an expert in that area. But the problem with this is that what happens when you move from forgiveness to revenge is that, as was said earlier, it's something that's been going on for a very long time. One of the reasons why it's been going on for a very long time is that because it's a vicious cycle. When you move from forgiveness to revenge, you become less willing to hear the other side. When you're less willing to hear the other side, it becomes much more difficult to find common ground. Again, if one thinks of, in the global context, the 40s to the 70s, when you had the civil rights movement, anti-Vietnam War, one of the major reasons for the successes of these movements is you had people from many different political platforms coming together to take a unified stand, who would otherwise disagree with each other, but they overcame those differences for a unified cause. But what we're seeing now is the opposite. So in the context of India, I'm sure many of you here are aware, you have the state slapping charges of sedition on people who express views that they don't agree with, right? I don't know how many of you have heard of Professor Sai Baba. He is a paraplegic, okay? He is a deeply sick person, requires intensive medical treatment, but he has recently been convicted of waging war against India, right? Nivedita Menon is a professor at JNU. She recently was invited to give a talk at a university in Rajasthan, and she was prevented by the administration from doing so on the charge that she was anti-national, and so on and so forth. You all know about what happened recently at Ramjas, Umar Khalid, Kanhaiya Kumar last year at JNU. So why is this happening? What is this phenomenon all about? Is that when we move from forgiveness to revenge, we go back to that Genghis Khan mentality, right? Which is we delegitimate the other of any notion that, you know, there's some possible common ground that we can find. The moment we see that someone who's different from us in any way is expressing a contrary opinion, we use, instead of trying to listen to them, and maybe forgive what we see as their mistake, we use everything in our power to silence them. In the time of Henry VIII, when he didn't like what his wife said, the silencing method was the guillotine. Now it's slapping charges of sedition or whatever it may be. So that is a fundamental danger. Now, I don't mean to say that it's all bad. In the context of the death penalty, there is one example that I'd like to talk about, and I'll leave you with this. Comes again from the United States. Some of you may have heard of the name of Dylan Roof. He is a white supremacist, and he was recently convicted of the mass murder of African Americans in a South Carolina church, which was, I think, in 2015 is when the massacre took place. Now, it's very interesting to compare his case to the case of Afzal Guru, who also received the death penalty a few years ago. Now, in the case of Dylan Roof, there is no question whatsoever as far as evidence is concerned. In fact, he was only too eager to confess himself as to what he had done. The state was very keen to impose the death penalty on Dylan Roof. It is the victims of his crime, the relatives of those who perished in that awful massacre, who actually came forward despite all of this and said, we want to forgive. We want to find it in our hearts to forgive. And some of them even said that we know that though our loved ones who lost their lives in this massacre, that this is what they would want. They would want to forgive. Okay. In the case of Afzal Guru, again, there was a death penalty. However, there have been some question marks, rightly or wrongly, that experts can debate, as to whether the process was a fair one or not for Afzal Guru in terms of the evidence presented, etc., etc. But what is happening in the case of Afzal Guru is, not only is it not being allowed, not only are we not being allowed, this is why I come back to the phenomenon of from forgiveness to revenge, is that we reach the stage where, at least here in India, we can't even, not only can we not question what happened to him, but anyone who questions what happened to him, they will be subject to the kind of censure that Kanhaiya Kumar and Umar Khalid have been subject to, right? Despite the fact, as in the case of Kanhaiya Kumar, which came out recently, the video, which supposedly he was charged with on the basis of, that was turned out to be doctored. There has still not been any charge sheet for Umar Khalid in terms of his connection with this incident. So that is the danger that we are moving towards here, And I think what we have to try and think about is, if we want to go back to that period when we were going from revenge to forgiveness, is to at least take the first step. Maybe forgiveness is too high a goal. Maybe we can't yet reach the level of the families of Dylan Roof's victims, who are way ahead of where we are in terms of how they found it in their heart to forgive. Maybe we can't get to that point just yet, right? But maybe we can start at least by, if not finding in our hearts to forgive, at least finding it in our hearts to try and listen to what the other side is saying, irrespective of which perspective we're coming from. Because there are cases where, in the recent past, people from the right have also been prevented from speaking out. But I think that is a core and key essential first step. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sachin. And we go directly to Ms. Shama Banu Abbasi, who's going to talk about the role of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in the paradigm of transition. Please.
If I may, how much time do I have?
You have 15 minutes.
Let me start by saying I am very honored to have this platform to put forth my views in front of a very willing audience, if I may, because I'm honestly glad that we have broken this paradigm of bringing students and faculty members to conferences just to fill up seats. So I'm really glad that I'm speaking to an audience that is willing and is here to listen and is willing to engage. Secondly, I am also very honored to be here because this is an exemplary platform, and for a young academic like me who has just made the transition from being a student to being a member of the faculty, this feels like a really, really big privilege. So let me, because of the paucity of time, get into what I am trying to say today, and that is situating the themes of what we have been talking about in a very narrow paradigm of transitional justice in post-conflict societies. So I am bringing back the abstractness of what we have been talking about, and not everything has been abstract, absolutely, but quite a bit of it has been, in comparison, abstract. So I'm trying to bring it back to the tangible domain of legal, wherein we can hopefully translate what we have been talking about into some sort of practice, right? So let me first make from here, take from here and start by painting a picture of, say, what has happened. I acknowledge that I'm speaking to an audience that has been here throughout the day and is probably overwhelmed with information. So let me try and invoke a little bit of emotion, right? So now I would like to paint a picture of what was maybe Gujarat first, right? So think of a young pregnant woman lying on a road wherein her baby who is yet unborn has been pulled outside of her, peed on, and then the baby has been burnt in front of her eyes while she was still alive and tortured. And then she was killed. Think of a Rwandan woman who was born in a family that was hated in the time she was born, and therefore she was raped in order to make sure that her child is not the child of the enemy, but maybe, if possible, if the rape results in a pregnancy, the child of the clan that is at the moment in the view of that particular clan righteous, right? And then think of a young Aboriginal girl in Australia who has been transposed from her Aboriginal home into a white home, telling her wherein that the civilization of the white will help her become a more civilized person. And think of her in the washroom trying to wash away the color from her skin because she really needs to be as pure as her alleged parents. If you put these in context, if you understand this picture, and if you are even able to empathize a little with the suffering of these women who I was just talking about, then you understand the need to address their concerns. In a society that has been torn by such sort of brutal violence, how do we address these concerns outside a paradigm which is now become legitimized through law, which is the legal justice system, the courts, and something that we call justice through punishment, right? So punishment in criminology has three different, possibly distinct, yet sometimes overlapping goals. One is retribution, the second is deterrence, and the third is the idea of rehabilitation. In trying to address a post-conflict society, also we try to understand the fact that this society has to now build itself from the ground up. It can no longer function as is. It has been torn apart by hatred. So to build it from ground up, there is a need for a certain legal mechanism, but will that legal mechanism within the four walls of a court where the justices are not from the town which is torn apart, where the people arguing for the rights of the victims and the people arguing for the rights of the accused are not people who understand the community and have come from within, would that paradigm be able to rehabilitate the society and help it build from ground up? So in that context, I propose that the current situation of international justice, which tries to punish the most inhumane acts, which have been termed to have shaken the conscience of humanity in ways which is traditional and very Western, would that then suffice? I speak to you from a very brief personal experience while I was working at the United Nations Mechanism for International Criminal Tribunals in Arusha, Tanzania. I can tell you from experience that the prisons that these genocidaires were put into were prisons that the UNDF said, which is the UN Detention Facility Chief, he told me were such that even if he leaves the doors open to those prisons, the prisoners would go nowhere because the life inside those prisons was much better than the life outside those prisons. We went there and we ate a meal which was much better than the meal we were served in the local canteen outside the ICTR building, because they were able to get funds from the UN to do that. And this seems very ludicrous to that one person who has been unjustly hurt in the genocide, right? So then what do? ICC tried to do something, right? They tried to move these people from just the viewing galleries of the ICTR and the ICTY into representation before the tribunal in the form of victim representation. So what ended up happening is now in the ICC, unlike the ICTR and the ICTY, we have a victims council representing the interests of all those who have been determined through a fairly arduous and tedious process to be victims of the genocide or of any other crime, which is crimes against humanity or war crimes that have been committed against certain individuals or groups of individuals. So this move was so that there is a symbolic acceptance that international justice does not just focus on these abstract ideas of justice which were propounded by Western philosophers to begin with and now are being served in courts where the judges are mostly not from the hometowns of those people who have been allegedly wronged, right? And to hear something like allegedly wronged in a court of law from the perspective of a victim would be fairly traumatic as well, because they would be sitting there thinking, what do you mean allegedly wronged? And the second very important thing, and now we transcend from the legal to the social aspects of this, is language, right? So the language used in these courts is French and English. The Rwandan people don't speak in French or English. They speak in Kinyarwanda, which is not a language that is being used to dole out the said justice, which is a problem, right? Because there is lack of communication between those who are trying to give justice and those who are allegedly now the recipients of that justice. So then what is the use of these tribunals? And in the social perspective, let me bring in something which will help my case, hopefully, in some ways. So I argue for Truth and Reconciliation Commissions over tribunals, and I argue that based on also the gender perspective that has been missing from the paradigm of international justice. And why has this perspective been missing? So I agree that most things around us which are gender are a social construction. I have never felt like a woman inside. There is nothing within me that feels woman or man. I feel fairly neutral, and to me, the pronoun it seems fairly acceptable. But leaving aside that personal bias against the social construct of gender, what has been considered feminine is this idea of a mother, right? So when a woman bears a child, that child wrongs her in many ways. First of all, she has to go through that labor that she goes through to bring that child into this world. That labor is in pain, is instantly forgiven the moment that child comes into her arms. Secondly, when this woman is trying to raise this child, and in a patriarchal paradigm, the mother raises the child more than the father. I agree that now it is not like that because, for instance, there would be fathers who would repent and cry and be upset on the child's death as much as the mother would. But if you think about it traditionally, in that paradigm, what you have is a mother forgiving her child again and again for indiscretions that that child commits. For instance, my mother once, I had a little brother who is no more, but that little brother once sat in my mother's lap and he pulled her earring. He pulled her earring so hard that her earlobe tore into half. And it never healed. She can no longer wear earrings in one of her ears. My mother's not angry at her child. My mother is not angry at the fact that he did what he did. And I understand that the connection between a perpetrator and a victim is never going to be that of a child and a mother. But at the same time, if we were to listen to this forgiving voice of a mother while we were trying to make sure that these policies about justice were made, then that forgiving voice of the mother would have led to a certain importance given to forgiveness, would have led to the value of forgiveness being understood in the paradigm of international justice, right? So then we move from the social, away from the social and into the psychological, because we have been talking a lot about the collective. We have been talking about the idea of Ubuntu from the first session onwards. We have been talking about how communities are what is important. However, at the individual level, is it okay to forgive? And Professor Vishwanathan also spoke about catharsism, but it is something else that I want to point out. So remember how we, maybe some of us watch Discovery and then have this idea of how animals supposed to behave. They only kill to eat, and they do not kill in order to exact vengeance, but that is not true. So I was watching this interesting documentary about lions and leopards. Lions and leopards, entire families kill each other because that they both struggle for resources, right? Because both of them, both of the prides, the lion's pride and the leopard's pride, want what is available to be hunted. And the lions usually end up killing the leopard cubs. And to exact vengeance of sorts, whenever the leopard gets a chance, they kill the lion's cubs. And also, this is not to in any way eat, right? So you see an animal killing another animal just for the sake of killing that other animal, whatever be the function of the limbic system. So we understand the limbic system is more prominent in the minds of animals, and that then it evolved into the frontal cortex when it came to human beings. So the limbic system tells you to protect your clan. The limbic system tells you it is important to kill the other before the other has a chance to kill you or your clan. And that kind of protection, that instinct that you have to protect your clan is what leads to this idea of vengeance. And this is a non-reflective instinct, right? So we have not reflected upon that idea. We just feel it inside. It's an instinct. It's instinctively human, we say. But is it instinctively human? Because animals do it too. So is it instinctively human is a question that psychologists probably would want to ask. And then the second level of this is that catharsism comes from forgiveness. If you forgive somebody, you feel a sense of humanity, if I'm to quote Professor Vishwanathan, return to you, and you give back the perpetrator his or her own humanity. So that is an important idea to grapple with. And I quickly move to the political, because my time's up, political, historical, and development angles of this. So political viability and historical viability has been shown. And one of the most important examples is Australia, where they have come up with a report called the Stolen Generations, where the prime ministers in Australia have been continuously apologizing to the Aborigines for pulling away the children of the Aborigines and putting them in white homes in a way to civilize them. So if we do that, we see that such gross injustice could be forgiven through truth-telling, through making sure that there was apology, to making sure that there was acknowledgement, then there is political and therefore historical viability for a model like this. And then there is a developmental and futuristic ideology behind it. The way I was talking about, a transitional society needs to build from ground up. So how do you build that society? You do not build it by subjecting it to criminal justice systems which are alien and away from what has really been happening in those societies. You build it by making sure that those societies are as much a part of the system of forgiveness, of doling out a new alternative model of justice as possible. And then I come to the last bit of what I'm going to say, and then I will end very quickly. The economic aspect of it, so stop thinking emotionally now. Stop thinking emotionally. What we will do now is examine the economic aspects of this. So what do we do to prisoners? Because now we have international standards of how to treat prisoners. And what we do to them is we keep them in cells on taxpayer money. Right? So this is a rhetoric that has been repeated again and again. We keep them on taxpayer money in these places instead of making sure that they become productive citizens within the social paradigm. So to bring forgiveness and apologies into the paradigm, we allow for them to become more respectful and more contributing citizens of society, and maybe as a result, more willing to participate. But let me problematize this before I leave you, right? One of the things that happened in Rwanda and Gacaca courts is there was this idea of forgiveness that came through the Gacaca grassroots level courts, which allowed for the perpetrator to tell the story of what he or she did, and then the victims to be able to say, I forgive you. But what happens if at the subjective level, you retain that anger? So this woman with all good heart forgave the perpetrators, but later on, this very wonderful and exemplary documentary maker tries to bring forth how the person who perpetrated the violence comes back to this woman and says, I just said that to say it, but I will come back to you with a vengeance, and the hatred I bear for your kind continues to live in my heart. So the idealistic picture I painted of transitional justice and using truth and reconciliation commissions to come about a resolution within conflict societies is not that simple, but it is at the same time a very viable option. And thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you, Shama. Without further ado, we go to Professor Gerd Ferdinand Kirchhoff, who is German-born, but he has lived in Asia for a long time. He taught in Japan, and and now lives in India. Teaches at Jindal. Please.
Warn me 2 minutes before my time is up.
Sure, yes. Yeah. And he's a victimization.
The last presentation this afternoon after a wonderful symposium full of great ideas, full of flowers which were blooming. I was very impressed, and I'm quite humbled that I have to speak at the last one here after such a great presentation before. We had so many ideas We had great ideas and we had preliminary ideas. I think what I want to say is pretty much preliminary. We had one observation, that was that forgiveness has to do with suffering. While I heard this, I saw in my inner eye, of course, I saw a TV picture which was done in Hanover last year. One of the guards of Auschwitz were there in front of the court to be punished. And a Jewish lady, I think she was 93 years old, she went to him and she hugged him and she told him, "I forgive you." And later she explained, "I forgive not for he especially deserved it, but for I deserve it." So much for lack of forgiveness and suffering. I was quite touched by this scene. My topic today is, and how do I change this presentation? You have seen this so long, I thought I bring you another presentation. Here we are. My topic was revengeful victims with a question mark. And let's see, yeah. Since centuries, you know this all, but since centuries, there are criminal justice systems developed to answer the crimes committed. Do victims want revenge? Victims have experienced a damage in 3 dimensions: emotional and physical and financial. It's a little bit strange to think that they want to have revenge for that. If you look at the damage, the first idea is, how do we restitute the damage? Damage need to be healed. Another victimization definition is victimizations are invasions into the self of the victim. Here I show you the onion, and I continue. Victimizations are invasions into the self of the victim. And these invasions cause crises. These are escalating situations of insecurity due to the fact that the usual crisis management potential is no longer available, is blocked. Victims show typical crisis reactions. I can give you lots of examples of this typical, but we don't have time for that. Yeah? They are afraid, they are confused, they are completely disoriented, they are angry, they are sad that nothing seems to be like it was before. The whole world seems to change. Shattered assumptions about the ability to stand this world and about the benevolence of this world. In our context, it's important to see that victims want to get out of this situation, of this stage. Here is our onion. What is the dangerous thing with victimizations? They tell us that we surround ourselves with stories about life which are not true. We permanently tell us stories about our own vulnerability, our own strength, and so on. And victimization destroy these protective shields of the stories we tell us. Without these protective shields, we cannot live. Shattered assumption, I mentioned this a concept of Janov Bullman already about life and our ability to master it. Crisis intervention with the goal to restore the emotional instability and to help the victim redevelop this sense of agency that they can live. Do victims want revenge? That is an empirical question. That's just an observation. We had very little empirical observations in our discussions. We had examples of extreme victimizations, and we learned quite a lot from them. But in reality, the picture of crime in the world is rather grey. So, it's an empirical question. Do victims want revenge? To deal with crime and victimization, society have developed the criminal justice system, as we had it. They punish offenders if and when they get the offenders. And that is, it sounds a little bit funny, but we have to realize that our systems are, we believe this is the normal way of dealing with crime, but it is not at all. There is only a minute amount of crimes which are brought into the system of police, prosecutor, court, and conviction. So the normal way for society is something else. And if we develop philosophies, with your kind permission, about punishment, then we have to know that these philosophies are valid for such a small part of the crimes which are committed. I have done research on hidden sexual victimization and on other hidden victimizations. You have to develop a feeling for that, how exceptional it is, what happens in our courts. The criminal justice response is not the normal response. It is the exception. It's kind of understandable if victims do not expect too much from these systems. If these systems handle only such a little part, why should victims expect a lot from these systems? And I ask myself, who is this who tells us that they expect so much? Who are the sense makers? I think not persons who listen to the voice of the victims. And these voices are not, as we know, voices for revenge. Why did these systems develop punishment? The powerful wanted to protect themselves against dangers from their power. And that was done by quick elimination of the danger. At times in England, we had 200 different crimes which were punished with the death penalty. And that was not only a threat. Voltaire writes about this time in Europe that the criminal justice systems are a bloody stage where judges stand and hangmans and where the victims of these bloody systems suffer. The interest of the victim was not in the center of the reaction. This interest is then constructed by sense makers, lawyers, philosophers. The state takes revenge instead of the victims. I apologize for this melody. Thank you, Omar. Do victims want revenge? In offender-oriented systems, they play a minute role. What is the empirical evidence for the belief that they want revenge? Why do victims turn to police and report their victimization? It is not for they want the offender to be punished. The idea is that the state does what victims want themselves to do with offenders. Turns out to be propaganda. The analysis of motives to invoke the criminal justice system is quite developed. We know why they report these few crimes to the system. Victims want that the victimization stops. If you look at domestic violence, for example, it's completely clear what victims want. They want that the violence stops. Stalking victims, they want that the stalking stops. Yeah? So that they will be secure again. It's abundantly clear in cases of, as I said, deprivation of liberty, in all cases of persistent duress and suffering. That has to be stopped. 95% of the victims inform the police, for they want the problematic event, that is terminology of the Dutch Luc Hulsman, philosopher and sociologist, for the problematic punitive, for the problematic event has to be stopped. Yeah? 98% want that something happens. They want that someone in authority states to the offender and to society that the behavior of the offender was wrong and unjust, and that he has to repair the damage. And if you ask them what the sentence they like, you get this answer. 55%, these are research from Austria, Switzerland, Netherlands and Germany. They want restitution of damage, 55%. 40% think of community service, 10% want payment to NGOs. In Austria, the punitive restitution is favored. The traditional fines and prison terms are not satisfactory. Less than 20% favor them. Do victims want revenge? This is my question. And I see this is what they want. Of course, there are victims who are revengeful. But these are not many, and especially not enough to justify a harsh sanction system. In the United States, we have sentence principles which are called 3 strikes and you are out. When you are 3 times sentenced, you are permanently in prison. You don't see the free world anymore. Prison terms for violent drug offenders, for non-violent drug offenders, sorry. That is obscene. You have in the United States 2 million people behind bars. That's quite astonishing. The revengeful victims are used, or the concept of the revengeful victims, are used to justify an overly abused system. Victims usually gain nothing by fines and prison terms. And this is a hint to me, do not stay here too long. Topic is, are victims revengeful? Okay, I come back to that. In the countries described, victims have the right to, or in some countries, victims have the right to participate in the criminal proceedings. That is a big slogan in this moment which governs the reform of the criminal procedure. Let the victims participate. I have asked myself, why the hell should they participate? But this is a common demand. Do prosecutors feel better if they participate? Do judges feel better? The victims themselves, maybe? In the countries I have just mentioned, 46% of the victims who are entitled to participate do that. That's less than 50%. 54 do not use this possibility. They have the right to act as a side prosecutor. On the side of the prosecutor with the same rights, right? In 1985, 30% of all entitled did that. That means 70 did not. And after 1985, 20%. Do I have to explain what side prosecutors do? They support, so to say, the prosecutor. Why does the prosecutor need support? That's not the point. The victim assigned prosecutor has access to the court files. And you know what that means in rape cases, for example. They know how the defendant is going to defend himself, whether this is a big burden for them or not. In cases of damage, traffic accidents and so on, they have the possibility to prepare the civil law proceedings against them. That is the reason why they act as side prosecutor. It is completely wrong to interpret that as they are revengeful, they want punishment, like the prosecutor. And these side prosecutors are usually quite defensive. All this tells me victims are not revengeful. They want restitution of damage. They want that the suffering stops. That is a realistic evaluation of the exceptional character of criminal justice solutions. These exceptions can achieve very little for victims. And that was it. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, Gert. And we have 10 minutes for two free questions. Yes, Mohit. Start, please.
Firstly, starting with Professor Sachin, you discussed the ability of states to punish to maintain order and the responsibility that states have towards their citizens to maintain order. And in that aspect, they have to sort of go ahead and do punish people. But you talk about the responsibility of leaders as to look for ideological advancements, to philosophically change the ideas and to motivate peace. But then my question over to you would be, when the leaders in a system of democracy are the reflections of the society, and as you correctly pointed out that how USA elected Trump as an act of revenge against all the suppression of the traditional voices of white Americans, then how do the leaders try to strive for peace when if they do strive for peace, they wouldn't even get because of the acts of another? Then wouldn't that same mother actually want sort of a revenge, some sort of compensation for the pain that she is feeling for the loss of the child? And coming on to Professor Kirchhoff, I'm sorry if I pronounced it wrong, but in your idea of punishment, you talk about the three stages, which is the physical, the emotional, and the financial. And in today's system, as I feel to notice, most of our criminal punishment systems, they only provide sanctions on the physical and financial part. However, the emotional damages that the victims are suffering are not completely reprimanded by the state, because as you said, when states are actually, as Professor Sharma said, when states are financing these prisons outside, when the prison life is more luxurious than the free life of the people outside, then justice isn't rightly delivered. Then I ask you this question: would you think it would be more progressive to actually focus on the criminal justice system on the psychology of the culprits, making them realize the total extent of their act? And that is something that I liked in your speech when you spoke about the ideology of these developed nations, especially Netherlands, Germany, and all these, where they say that they prove more importance on the psychology of the victims rather and less importance of keeping them in prison or like giving them the death penalty. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please, quick.
Hi. I just have one question and one comment, but the question is to Sachin, if I may call you that. Okay. With all due respect, I sort of differ with you on the points that you made, and that's because the phase and the examples that you gave, which was representative of forgiveness, to me was not really that, because I think the civil rights movement, the Indian independence movement, they all came out of and a stoppage to tolerance. It's because we wanted social change, did all these movements come out. So it's almost like we chose not to forgive, but we chose to rise up. And that's why these movements came in. So in that sense, while you choose in the current context to talk about revenge in the sense of Trump or the rising Hindutva, what about movements which are against dominant groups? Does then forgiveness become an obstacle to that? What about tribal movements in Jharkhand? Because it is for the longest time that they have, the same thing was told to them that, just forgive and forget. You've been looted for years, but just forgive. But it's now that they've sort of risen up. So that's where I think that it's more about justice and rights rather than seeing it as a move from forgiveness to revenge. And my second is just a comment, and it's, I think, open to everyone because I think it's for all the sessions. But while we all spoke about the person who is forgiving, I think it's also important to talk about people who seek forgiveness, because that's something I think Shama sort of touched on, because I feel, and I think it's psychologically very important, because there was someone who was talking about Sita and Ram in the afternoon, and how Sita, because she sort of forgave and went into the earth, Ram went crazy and couldn't forgive himself and was crazy out of guilt for 3,000 years. So sometimes if you're not ready to seek forgiveness, that can cause a lot of distress and guilt. So while forgiveness is definitely seems to be a less popular theme than revenge in popular culture and everything, but it still seems that the victim's forgiveness is spoken about more than the perpetrator's willingness or the ability to seek forgiveness. And that also requires letting go of ego and various things like that. So I think that's also something that...
Thank you very much. We keep it there, and I turn to the panelists to answer, because we have to finish by 5:30, and Ashok Vajpayee is giving his talk on poetry. Yes, Sachin, we start with you.
Okay. Mohit, the first thing I would say is that Hillary got more votes, right? So when we think of leaders and how they reflect the populations, I mean, Donald Trump isn't necessarily a reflection of the population, but that's an argument that people can have about how representative he is. But beyond that, what I would say is that what is happening now is that, which is different from that period of the 40s to the 70s, is that people are not willing to even see eye to eye or even come to the bargaining table together, right? They are falling into their own kind of separate camps. I mean, there was a New York Times article recently about how all these social media sites are now trying to come up with all these new provisions whereby you can see and read the articles that people who have a different view from you, say if you're a liberal, you can look at what conservatives read, So they're trying to create this situation where now people can get access to what the other side thinks and believes. Because if you actually look at what, studies have been done about this, people from different, I'm talking now in the context of the US, people who hold different viewpoints and have different belief systems, their views are so radically opposed to one another that it's like they're not even living on the same planet, There was a study done of Trump voters, I think last year or maybe early this year, and they said that, a majority of them believe that there's a civil war coming or something like that. So they believe that, Hillary Clinton is some kind of a mastermind criminal, et cetera, et cetera. So the point is that, see, one is who wins and who loses, and that will keep changing and has always changed, and there'll be cycles. But if we aren't willing to even view the other side as being worthy of conversation and debate and dialogue and discussion, as Raveen talks about in his book on Socratic gadflies, then there's no way we can at least begin to think about forgiveness, right, and move from revenge to forgiveness. That was kind of what I was saying. And in terms of the other question, I think it is definitely the case that the civil rights movement and the independence movement were not wholly based on forgiveness, and I wasn't suggesting that. But I think that forgiveness was perhaps an element, because they were non-violent struggles and revolutions. And part of the reason that they were non-violent was because Gandhi and King persuaded, to whatever extent that they could, Indians and African Americans, that their white and British brothers and sisters were worthy. This is what I was saying to Mohit. Were worthy. They may not agree with them. You're right about that, and that's why people rose up. But that the other side was at least worthy of giving some kind of basic respect and decency to, and that they had this basic humanity, which required, the Indians and the African Americans to be non-violent and not to go in the non-violent direction that some in India and in the US were advocating.
Thank you.
Who did this? She does not name the perpetrator, and this translates into the anecdote Professor Shiv was talking about, where he was saying that the father forgave the perpetrators and wouldn't divulge the name of the perpetrators of the atrocities against his child. So a mother's instinct or the maternal instinct remains a force for good, which could inform the whole idea. And just a brief comment on the comment that the lady in the second row made, is that I wanted to allude to the idea of the perpetrator seeking forgiveness and trying to apologize, because that is what the Australian state, possibly, if you allowed for communal forgiveness, tried to do when they said, okay, we are going to have this Truth and Reconciliation Commission and apologize to those from whom we have stolen generations, right? So that is something which is a very important aspect of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, but we do not have time to go into that. Thank you very much.
You asked whether I would be more happy if the psychological damage of victims is thematized more in the criminal proceedings, in the oral proceedings. Yeah? Difficult to answer. I try. I know that the criminal justice system is a system of social control via repression of offenders. So that is behind it. If the psychological damage of the victim is used to make this repression more harsh, then I'm against it. I'm against victim impact statements which heat up the atmosphere in the courtroom and create a stronger anti-offender sentiment and atmosphere. We don't need that. It is difficult enough for offenders. We need something which is good for victims, and that is that all persons who are involved in the criminal justice system learn how to avoid secondary victimization. Their reaction can damage victims, and that is avoidable. I'm sure that no one wants to do that. And this is why I, as a victimologist, am quite optimistic that we can convince judges and prosecutors to improve their system, but not if the psychological damage is used to make repression of offenders harsher. Second idea is we have restorative justice. That is not a punishing justice. It is a system where the damage is really in the center, and where, under the headline healing justice or restorative justice, these consequences, the damaging consequences, are tried to heal or to remove. That is the future. And I see worldwide a growing movement towards restorative justice, and therefore, Sachin, I'm not so convinced that you are absolutely right that things get more and more repressive. There is a counter movement, certainly that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I ask you to sit down, don't move. I ask the people to bring the token of thanks to our panelists. And after that, we go immediately to Ashok Vajpayee, who's going to close our conference and talk about poetry and revenge and forgiveness. Thank you. Oh, I can give it to them. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.